After hearing about the riverboat traveling to the holiday destination of Point Lookout, you decide maybe it's time to take a break from all of the heroics in the capital wasteland and soak up the rads elsewhere. As you walk over to the riverboat known as the Duchess Gambit, preparing for the holiday of a lifetime, you are stopped by a woman. She says to you,
Are you going to Point Lookout? I need your help. My daughter stowed away on the Duchess Gambit a few weeks ago, and I've been worried sick ever since. I haven't heard anything from her, but if you're going there, could you look for her? Please, I'll do anything to help.
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing the Point Lookout main quest. To do this, we will need to go over several things. Who are the cult involved in the taking of Nadine? So, who are the important characters within this cult, and who does this cult worship? Who else is involved with this quest outside of the cult, and what purpose do they serve? So we should begin with who are the cult. The cult that Nadine has joined is known as the Point Lookout Tribals. Now these tribals are different from the swamp folk we see in the other cult, not just in appearance, but also in religion. The Point Lookout Tribals do not worship the Krivbekna, instead worshipping what is known as the Transcendent One as their god, also having very different worship practices. They are much more peaceful than the swamp folk, unless following orders by the Transcendent One. Most of their rituals are based around the punga fruit and meditation. We find this cult at the Ark and Dove Cathedral after performing the initiation ritual, of course. This being the ritual where you walk through the sacred bog and essentially inhale the pollen from the mother punga, which has some hallucinogenic effects. During this initiation ritual, there are several interesting things you may have noticed, including the Schmaltech bobbleheads, these being a larger knockoff of the bobbleheads found throughout the game. These bobbleheads comment on the insecurities that the Lone Wanderer has obtained over the years, as well as just generally taunt them. We see this with the intelligence bobblehead calling the Lone Wanderer stupid and suggesting they fell into another trap. Considering what is actually going on, that could be seen as rather relevant. Or the charisma bobblehead, depicted near dear old mum, who claims they would abandon you for looking like that too. How lovely. But don't worry, she is not the only familiar face that you find, especially of those who you have grown to care about. That being, if you did not play the evil path, there is also your dear friend Moira, and even Elder Lions, well, their bodies anyway, on the path to find the luck bobblehead that claims you are friendless and alone in the nuclear wasteland. I don't know about you, but I think the Lone Wanderer may need some therapy. But anyway, after wandering through the sacred bog, the Lone Wanderer is an initiated member of the Point Lookout Tribals. Now that we are allowed into the Ark and Dove Cathedral, we should discuss some of the important characters we find in there. So there are several important characters we run into inside of the Ark and Dove compound. The first of these actually not being in the compound is Jackson. He's important, however, as he is the leader of the tribals, and actually the founder of their religion. If you remember the swamp folk that you find in Point Lookout, Jackson is actually one of them. However, he was abandoned due to not being born with the look, because apparently, to swamp folks, looks at everything. So alone he would wander the island, this being until he would run into something interesting whilst he was going through the wreckage of a ship. In this wreckage he would find a strange device and accidentally activate it. This device, once turned on, would produce a hologram of who would become known as the Transcendent One. Because Jackson is an incredibly superstitious person, like the other swamp folk, he would believe that a god or deity would be talking to him. So he would start visiting this strange hologram of a head, well, a brain, regularly, believing it to be a god. He was able to commune with this. And this is when he would start to build his tribe, with the guidance from the talking head on how to build certain things like hydroponics, which would allow the group to be successful in producing an overabundance of supplies. But Jackson is not the only member of the tribe at the Ark and Dove Cathedral, otherwise this would not be a cult. So one of the other members of the cult is Woodrose. She is the tribal matriarch.
Another new member? What, are we offering a special? Punga may have offered you wisdom, but it looks like it's still going to be a while before you really learn to accept it. Until then, you answer to me. I'm Woodrose, the tribe mother.
You could say she does not take this position lightly, based on how welcoming she was in her greeting. But other than welcoming new members, she takes care of those that can no longer care for themselves after the initiation, which we see a few wandering around the cathedral. There are also other members who have retained some of their senses that we see throughout the cathedral, one of these being Jimson, who happens to be essentially the gatekeeper, and one of the more senior members of the tribe. He, like Jackson, is a highly superstitious member of the cult and is in charge of spreading any messages and orders to the others who have yet to receive telepathic messages that the Great Leader sends to his followers. He is also the member of the tribe that will send you to the Sacred Bog as part of your initiation journey. Moving on to one of the more gentle members, there is Tobar. Now he knows his way around a shovel apparently, being a gardener, not a fighter. And if one can make his acquaintance, he will share his shovel with you. It apparently makes a great weapon, considering it could poison you if you were hit by it. But anyway, he prefers the company of the Punga Fruit rather than waging war against the enemies of the Transcendent One, which is why he most likely won't attack, even if you choose to side with the enemies of the tribe. There is another neutral character when it comes to this tribe, or you could even consider this character to be on your side no matter what, this being the stowaway by the name of Nadine. Yes, as it turns out, she has been busy since leaving her poor old mum worried back in the capital wastelands, joining a cult, like every parent fears. Kids these days. But don't worry, she's also got other hobbies, like plastic surgery, boat theft, and maybe even a little murder, but only if the mood is right.
What is this, a date? You start making a move and it's stabbing time.
Nadine left the wastelands in DC in search for adventure and riches, hoping that the cult, once she encountered it, would bring enjoyment or at least something interesting. However, she grew bored pretty quickly, realizing that the cult was not as it seemed. Since we have discussed the members of the cult, we should move on to who really is pulling all of the strings.
Would that I was so wise. No. True leadership of the tribe belongs to the higher mind of the Enlightened One. Although his mind has moved beyond the need for flesh, his consciousness still returns here to guide our people. I merely interpret his wishes. He manifests here, high on a ledge in the great sea cave's well. Perhaps, if you are fortunate, he will choose to share his wisdom with you.
Now, let us discuss who the Point Lookout tribals worship. This cult worships the god they call the Transcendent One, or the Transcendent Master. However, this was not always his name. Previously, he was known as Professor Calvert. In pre-war times, he was a scientist who was an expert in the field of cognitive robotics. Pre-war, he would join a government project working on what would essentially be robo-brains, testing to see how brains would perform in the biogels, which were used to keep the brains alive after removal from their donor body, which Calvert would become intrigued about. Now, Professor Calvert is essentially a type of robo-brain, although he's not rolling around the Commonwealth like the others, using this as a way to preserve himself as he is a pre-war entity. This was done in part as a way of preventing the complications he could have faced due to the radiation from the nuclear war, but him remaining as just a brain in the biogel is the result of an experiment gone wrong. So this entire situation makes him well over 200 years old, considering that the Lone Wanderer leaves the vault in 2277, which is 200 years after the bombs dropped. So the biogel that houses Calvert's brain may be a little stale, considering prolonged use without changing can cause degradation of the brain it is supposed to serve. So this may explain some of Calvert's eccentricities, considering that there were notes mentioning that psychological issues may occur with prolonged exposure. However, it was not studied. An interesting point with the biogel is that this material also helps with projection of psychic and telekinetic thoughts, which would have further solidified his place as the god of the Point Lookout tribals. However, there were some issues with this. Firstly, the commands he gives would be rather literal orders or requests, but Jackson and his group of tribals would take more of a spiritual interpretation more often than not, which we can see Calvert being rather irritated by this.
At last, yes! Desmond will die, and our long struggle will finally end the only way it could have, with me as the victor!
Yes, and you will be able to spread your knowledge across the astral plane for all those wise enough to accept it.
No, not astral knowledge.
My meditation requires utmost concentration.
And that still won't be possible until you destroy Desmond's jamming device.
Secondly, his army of tribals, even when taking orders somewhat seriously, are somewhat skilled when it comes to failing the mission. In the entire time the cult has existed, not one has managed to successfully kill or even injure the ghoul inside of Calvert Mansion. And thirdly, he doesn't quite have the range or abilities he desires, this being due to the meddling of his lifelong rival, Desmond, and his use of a jamming signal preventing him from being able to essentially broadcast his psychic mind control brainwaves throughout the rest of the island, with what may be a second jammer on the way which could completely destroy Calvert's ability to control others, stopping all of Calvert's plans for control of the island, and then of course total world domination. Well, what's left of the world. But who else is involved in the Point Lookout tribals, outside of the Ark and Dove Cathedral and their not-so-godly god? Well, if you ignore Catherine, the first person you meet on your way to Point Lookout is actually involved. He is the person who drives the ferry that takes you to Point Lookout, this being Tobar. But how exactly is the man who is the only way in and out of Point Lookout actually involved with the tribals of Point Lookout? Considering they don't really leave the island, well, Tobar has a sort of trade alliance with the tribals. Tobar gets the oversupply of the punka fruit that the tribals produce in return for Tobar performing surgery on the new initiates during their initiation inside of the sacred bog. Tobar playing doctor by removing part of your brain that is supposedly holding you back. We know all about these surgeries because of Nadine, who happens to be the whole reason you come out to Point Lookout.
You sure you're feeling okay in there? You might want to check your head for a scar. We all get them after going to that bog. You know, the last part of the ritual. After you pass out, they get a guy to bring you back, cut open your skull, and free your mind. As in, he rips out a bit of your brain. It's supposed to be the part that holds you back, but that doesn't always work out so good.
Tobar performing these surgeries actually makes it into the visions that are part of the sacred bog hallucinations. We see the beginning of the surgery where your head is opened up, being where you hallucinate a floating bone saw cutting. The needle that is sewing its way through the air and ground along your path, that is when your head is sewn shut by Tobar after he has taken out part of your brain. And Mr. Break talking to you, this is also Tobar talking to you as he finishes off his part of the deal.
No, don't try and get up yet. You'll only hurt yourself.
So these back-of-the-boat lobotomies were not always successful, nor did those who were receiving them know they were having surgery performed. We could potentially see them being somewhat unsuccessful with how Croatoa's speech is affected, and how he has a more childlike demeanor than several of the others around the cathedral.
You are new, and you are welcome. I am Croatoa. I am not so new.
Because of this, those who learn about the back alley procedure are not always too pleased about it, considering a random ferryman with minimal medical experience is just ripping parts of people's brains out. However, Tobar is not the only outsider to the tribe that we see throughout the main quest in this DLC. We also meet a ghoul by the name of Desmond Lockhart. Now, Desmond was a pre-war intelligence agent who previously knew the Transcendent One when they were known as Professor Calvert. These two actually knew each other prior to the war, and right before the war had somewhat of a rivalry that you could say bordered on hatred. Now, there are two things you will notice about Desmond. First, he is British, and secondly, he is a ghoul. You may think his ghoulification was an unfortunate side effect of the bombs dropping on the 23rd of October 2077, when in fact it occurred before. But how? Well, he, as part of a sort of experiment, was repeatedly exposed to dangerous levels of radiation slowly, which of course would turn him into a ghoul. He is one of the few pre-bomb cases of ghoulification. This extreme procedure also makes him 250 years old. This is what he did as a version of preparation for the bombs to be fired during the Great War. This being his way to continue his part of the Great Game, which was a previously silent and non-physical battle for control. During this, Calvert and Desmond began to butt heads and begin their dislike for each other. With this, Calvert would exclude Desmond from an important pre-war dinner with none other than Hugo and Cassidy Stolz, who happened to be on the board of directors of Vault Tech, and also people who thought highly of Desmond. They, like Calvert, were also influential in the field of robotics. But this behavior would leave Calvert more isolated. The hatred between the two would worsen with Desmond sabotaging Calvert's experiment, which would leave him as just a disembodied brain, literally. With Calvert and Desmond surviving the bombs, they would continue their rivalry. Desmond would essentially encourage this by moving into Calvert Mansion, and we would see the manipulation of the tribals through a conversation with Jimson.
Our most enlightened one divined that the fates themselves did decree the mansion must be burnt to the ground.
This was used as a way of attacking Desmond, and Desmond would also stop much of Calvert's influence through the use of jammers as a way of limiting who he was able to control the minds of. Desmond would also use his access to the data stored within the Calvert Mansion as a way to further ensure his ability to win the game and defeat Calvert. With the main quest in Point Lookout, we see much of the underlying storyline surrounding a post-war rivalry, with much of the issues relating to a long-standing desire for revenge and removal of rivals. Calvert's choice to experiment with the biogel and become essentially a robo-brain without many of the abilities, after 200 years of exposure, would leave him basically a deranged and scheming disembodied brain. With Desmond becoming a ghoul and choosing to continue to pursue his rivals over 200 years after the war, when there would be no power, no benefit or gain in this, all it would be is obsession with an old world network of figures once deemed to be powerful that he wishes to destroy. The Point Lookout tribals in this, although not the most innocent, are also not to blame. Due to the hallucinogenic nature of the punga fruit and the highly superstitious nature of the group, they were taken advantage of by multiple parties including Calvert and also Tobar, who would cause serious damage to many of those living within the cathedral, requiring round-the-clock care from Woodrose. So let me know in the comments, who would you side with, Calvert or Desmond? If you enjoyed this video, then you will enjoy this one. It is about the other cult in Point Lookout and who deserves the book that their religion is based off of.